Really wonderful to see so many people here from UKIP and supporting us. So thank you all for coming. A few weeks ago, things didn't look so good and rosy for us, and the media were writing us off, as always, saying this is the end of the road for UKIP. They've done their job. Why don't you go home, pack up, and leave Brexit to Mrs. May? Well, yeah, I hear the laughter from you because that's probably not a very, very good idea at all. But I am so happy that we have, as a wonderful new leader, Gerard Batten, who I think is going to speak to us later on. Here, not me, who's completely restored the fortunes of the party and inspired so many people to give, to come back, to rejoin, to join the fight again, because we have great purpose for Brexit and beyond as a party. And let no man, let no media journalist, let no pundit ever tell you otherwise, because we are the most successful political force in 100 years in this country, who has fought for and won the referendum to take us out of the European Union, which was sucking our sovereignty and our democracy and our money and our freedom away from us, the ordinary working man and woman on the streets, and would leave our country with nothing left but being a few provinces on the edge of a European superstate called the United States of Europe. But we have changed the course of history, and that is not going to happen, and we are going to go forward into our freedom, our independence, and we are going to rebuild this great nation once again, because we are a great nation with a great history, and I very much look forward to the future. Now, of course, we know that Brexit has not happened yet. Unfortunately, we are not a few moments walk away installed in the Houses of Parliament, and we've got all these other people who are doing what we should be doing, and they're not doing a very good job. So we must make sure that they deliver what the people have voted for. But we also have great purpose beyond Brexit, and I've always believed in that from the very big moment I joined this party about 5 years ago. I joined this party because of TTIP. Some of you may or may not have heard of that thing, and that was going to take sovereignty not just from Britain to the EU, but from the EU to a corporate courts outside. It was going to remove power one step further from the people. But there's enough people in this country who will mess it up for us, even if we do leave the European Union. And I talk a lot about cultural Marxism, and I go around the country speaking about this. And I've spoken to 5 or 6 different branches in different areas of the country about this. And taking us into the EU was just one step in trying to dissolve the nation, to dissolve our heritage, to deconstruct the things which give us purpose, identity and belonging. Things like the family, things like marriage, things like the very concept of male and female these days. And we know what's being taught in our schools to very young children. The government and people backed by the government are saying you mustn't use the words boys and girls anymore because that's harmful to children. I mean, you really couldn't make this up. It sounds like a Monty Python comedy, but it's actually really happening, and people are very seriously indoctrinating our children with the craziest of ideas, which are taking away all sense of identity and belonging, and will mess up a whole generation of kids. No one has really fought this successfully, because what I call the Lib Lab Con Uniparty. Uniparty is a word actually coined by my great friend Raheem Kassam who is a wonderful journalist and reporter, as you may know, and the editor-in-chief of Breitbart London. He came up with this word, the uniparty, which perfectly describes how the three main political parties just act in step with one another to bring in the same agenda. It doesn't matter whether you vote for the blue team or the yellow team or the red team, they're really all doing exactly the same thing, and they're pushing such ridiculous nonsense on our country and, more importantly, in our schools. And no one is going to stand up to that apart from us in the purple team, in UKIP. And that is a great purpose that we have beyond Brexit. So I'm so glad that Gerard has put us back on the map, as growing us into a strong and sturdy party once again, because the country needs us, the people need us. People are crying out for an alternative to the craziness of what's going on in Westminster and is being pushed on our country. And we are the party, we are the People's Army who will go forward and rebuild this country and make it sane and make it great again. So thank you for coming, thank you for rejoining, thank you for carrying on being members, supporting us tonight, and long may the People's Army continue to fight and make this country great again. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, David. But it's nice to know somebody's got a voice that's sort of on a par with mine. I'm Stuart Agnew, a member of the European Parliament, been in the party since the late 1990s, and I am the agriculture spokesman. Somebody's interrupting. Please don't interrupt. Not a good idea at all. And I'm just going to quickly talk about the three great hypocrisies in agriculture, which I'm frightened now that Mr. Gove is going to follow on in these three hypocrisies. And the first involves insecticides. Now, we grow crops and they get attacked by insects, and insects carry viruses and they inject them into the crops, and the crops go yellow very early on in life and you get a disastrous yield. And over the years we have tried to combat this with spraying and spraying and spraying, and of course we kill all sorts of other things when we spray like that. A number of years ago, some very bright British scientists invented something called a neonicotinoid seed dressing, and that was just smeared onto the seed, and the seed was planted, and so the insecticide was only once every few square inches instead of everywhere, and of course you only had to do it once. This has been enormously helpful. However, the Green lobby have said, oh, you can't do that, it's going to hurt the bees. So what are we going to do? We're going to have to go back to the old system of spraying regularly with a broad spectrum insecticide that kills everything everywhere. I suggest that this is a very silly thing to do. And if we don't do anything at all, we will simply import the crops from countries that are allowed to do these things, and there is nothing we can do about that, because WTO rules say you can only ban something if it's going to hurt human health, animal health or plant health. And as these crops won't do that, we will simply export the industry to the benefit of farmers elsewhere in the world who use all the things we're not allowed to do. So that's hypocrisy number one. Hypocrisy number two is GM crops. We are going to eat a meal tonight, and I can guarantee half of what you eat tonight will be derived from a GM crop, in part. Now, you eat this very happily and have been doing so for the last 20 years. Farmers, though, are not allowed to grow these crops that you eat quite happily if they're imported, mainly soybeans for the consumption by animals. I would like to see some sense in this. Either you are all banned from eating these things, or the farmers are allowed to grow them. But at the moment, you're allowed to eat them, we are not allowed to grow them. Is that hypocrisy, or isn't it? Yeah. I would say it's gross hypocrisy. Good labelling, that's all you need. If you don't want to eat something that's GM derived, you don't have to. Buy organic. Spend the money if you want to. Now, the third great hypocrisy is this nonsense about global warming and climate change and what farmers are supposed to do about it. Now, many of you will have heard of the term, well, let's start again, shall I? Because I think it's quite a good lead in. I'm a politician now. I didn't think I was, but I am now. I thought I was a farmer. And politicians spout hot air. They spout gas, and let's just turn that into greenhouse gas, shall we? And there's 5 of those. Many people are not aware of this. They think, you asked them. Yes, sir. Friday in a school talking about greenhouse gases. They just think there are only two, CO2 and methane. Actually there are 5, and farmers produce 4 of them. And farmers are being told, oh, you must cut down your greenhouse gas emission. So what does that actually mean on the farm? Well, the biggest greenhouse gas of the lot is something called water vapour, the cloud cover, the transpiration through our crops into the atmosphere. Well, they keep rather quiet about that one because it's pretty stupid to tell farmers to stop growing crops and grass. So that, although that's the biggest of the greenhouse gases, they keep rather quiet. Then we will just bring in the one that farmers don't produce, which is ozone. So that's nothing to do with us, but it's interesting. This is a greenhouse gas that they're saying, oh, there's not enough of this. We've got an ozone hole in the atmosphere. We must have more of that particular greenhouse gas. So it's getting a little bit inconsistent. Then we go on to one called methane. Now, methane is produced, a great deal of it, in rainforests. Well, we all want to preserve the rainforest, but if you really seriously want to do something about methane, get rid of the rainforest. Well, nobody's going to do that. So they point at the farmers and say, you've got cattle and you've got sheep, and they are producing methane, not only from one end, but also from the other. You've got to do something about this. Well, these are God's own creatures. These are quite natural. They roam the world in their millions over the great plains of Africa, Asia, and America. There is nothing wrong with producing methane at all. And the European Union have said to us, oh, well, in order to stop these sheep and cattle producing so much methane, instead of feeding them grass and silage and hay, no, you must feed them concentrates and corn, because those materials won't produce so much methane when they're digested. Isn't that madness? I mean, grass is a very useful thing. Sheep and cattle eat it. We can't eat grass. Perhaps somebody could tell a politician that. So they then, having sort of realised that this was a bit mad, then said, well, what we're going to do, we're going to breed selectively from those sheep and cattle that don't produce very much methane. Now, how are you going to find out whether Molly produces more methane than Carrie? Presumably you're going to have to tie a bag to her nose and one to her backside and measure it all. Having established who are the biggest, shall we say, emitters, you then can only breed from that one. Well, we might be able to do that if we were allowed to use modern breeding methods, GM and gene editing. If they ban that, we are never going to get there down that route. So that's another hypocrisy. The next hypocrisy, of course, is CO2, the one they think is the most evil gas, terrible thing. That would not be green if it wasn't for CO2. We desperately need this material. Only 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. If it drops down to 280, that will go yellow. It is as simple as that. Some growers in greenhouses actually pump CO2 into the greenhouse. They bring it up to 1200 because the crops grow faster as a result. That's the only thing you'll notice with CO2. The more you have, the greener things are, the faster crops grow. Well, the EU and all these greenies, no, you've got to produce less of this. So how are farmers producing CO2? Tractors, engines, anything that uses diesel emits CO2 from the exhaust. So they say you've got to cut that down. Well, one of the ways we use a lot of fuel is in cultivation. Ploughing, cultivating, drilling the crop. That's where a lot of CO2 is burned. A lot of fuel is used, CO2 is emitted. Well, we can go down that route if we're allowed to use glyphosate, which everyone says, oh, you mustn't use that. And if we're allowed to grow GM crops that are resistant to glyphosate, we can slash the amount of CO2 we emit. But that's the only way we can do it. So that's another hypocrisy. Now, the final hypocrisy, and that ends on a little bit of a lighter note, is something called nitrous oxide, not to be confused with nitrogen dioxide, which my chemistry friend over here will tell you is a pollutant. Nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. How do farmers produce that one? By growing leguminous crops. That's how we produce it. Where's the hypocrisy in this? Oh, the European Union say, we want you to reduce your nitrous oxide emissions, but at the same time we want you to grow more protein crops because they were so embarrassed about the 30 million tonnes of GM soybeans that we're importing from South America. So on the one hand they're saying grow more protein, which means leguminous crops. On the other hand they're saying you must reduce your nitrous oxide emissions, and the only way we produce them is through leguminous crops. But it isn't just that. The farmer himself is a bit responsible, and so are all the men in here, for producing nitrous oxide, because when we get amorous, our lower body changes shape, you may have noticed. In order for that to happen, we first of all have to produce some nitrous oxide. So chaps, it's not just a matter of not doing any sex. If you want to save the planet, don't even think about it. Thank you very much.
Professor Patrick Minford. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I wish I could measure up to that vocal magnificence. Terrific introduction and tremendously audible, which is great. So I shall treat this as an exercise in vocalization to make sure that as many of you as possible can hear me. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be invited and to be speaking to you guys tonight. You know, UKIP has been the key player in the last few years of our country, and that's why I'm really delighted to be here tonight to celebrate, you know, what I hope will be the future of UKIP ahead of us, because it has a very important role to play. You know, a lot of people don't think that UKIP talked economics. I'm a professor of economics, but I want to tell you that UKIP speaks economics. And actually it was the only group in the referendum that spoke economics. Of course it was fashionable among the other parties to say, oh, UKIP, you know, they don't do economics, they do whatever. And they insulted you in various ways, which I won't go into. But the truth is that UKIP was the voice of economic reason and reality. And you may not even have realized that before now. But I have to tell you, as a professor of economics and someone who tried to explain the economics of leaving the EU, you produced the proper arguments. And, you know, Nigel Farage, and now Gerard Batten, your new leader, you represent the economic voice of debate. And you explained it in clear language to ordinary people what the economic arguments were, how the EU was exploiting them economically. Now, of course, everybody understands the lack of democracy of the EU. It's sort of like an obvious point, isn't it? But of course, that's basically also an economic point, because if you don't control your laws, how can you control your economy and how your living standard develops, which is the most important thing to most people? Of course, everybody wants political freedom, but they also want economic freedom. And it's a pretty obvious point that the EU took away from us our political freedom. But what many people didn't understand was how they took away our economic freedom. And that they did in very specific ways. And what was explained in the referendum by UKIP and by those of us that tried to help UKIP in their task was that there was very specific exploitation of ordinary people. They were paying higher prices for things than they needed to pay. Quite a lot higher prices. We calculated the cost of living was 8% higher because of the EU. Now that seems like a very precise number, based on some estimates we made of how much the protection of the EU was, how much we were paying more for goods from all over the world because of EU protection. Now people talk about the customs union, and I'll come back to that, The customs union is the way the EU raises prices. It puts tariffs and other barriers in against producers from the rest of the world, and so it raises their prices. And we calculated it raises the price of food and manufactures by no less than a fifth, 20%. This is a huge number. And it leads to that calculation that the cost of living in Britain is 8% higher than it should be. Now, because of the EU. And of course, you see, that has knock-on effects, because our own producers who produce these things at these inflated prices are inefficient. And that's a further problem for our people, that productivity is lower than it should be. So high prices, low productivity, because there's less competition. And then you've got regulation. And regulation in the EU is extremely intrusive. The whole single market system intrudes into every part of our economy. You know, the labour market, climate change and energy, which industries, what the regulations are for industries, so that big business is favoured at the expense of small business. And finance. Our financiers are lumbered with all sorts of intrusive regulation from Brussels that is anti-finance. Because why? They don't have a financial industry in the EU. It's here, in London, which is the main financial centre of the world. So naturally the EU legislates with intrusive regulation to make sure that we're as inefficient as possible, that they lumber our financial industry with regulations that are not designed for finance. But then I come to the thing that is perhaps most important to ordinary people, which is unskilled immigration. Now, a lot of people said this is just sort of politics and sort of wrong hostility to foreigners. It couldn't be further from the truth. The British people are very welcoming to foreigners. We have always welcomed people from all around the world. But what happened in the last 15-odd years was a massive wave of unskilled immigration. Now the thing is that a lot of people who are on the other side of the debate said immigration's great, because look, we get lots of skilled people who come into Britain. Of course that's true. Nobody is against immigration as such. But if you subsidize unskilled immigration by what the EU made us do, which is 20%, I can tell you that we did the calculations on what it costs for an unskilled immigrant from the EU to come here. It costs every person in the UK £3,500 per unskilled immigrant. In NHS costs, education costs, housing costs, tax credits. And because they're unskilled, they don't pay any tax. So many people criticize UKIP for making a lot of this issue. But actually, it's probably the most important economic issue of all. Because another thing that we found out from research done by a colleague of mine, Professor Steve Nicol, for the Bank of England, was that a 10% rise in the supply of unskilled immigrants lowers wages for unskilled UK workers by 2%. And that's quite a big number. And if you then think about the fact that in poorer areas of our country, that's where unskilled immigrants go, of course, because that's where they can afford to have houses or pay rents. So what that means is that poorer people in our country suffer kind of, we estimate, from double the cost, because that's where they congregate. And so we calculated that poorer people in our communities, due to the combination of higher prices, of course food prices being importantly higher as a result of EU because it protects food by this 20%, they suffer from a sort of triple whammy. First of all, the cost of living for them goes up 10% because they have a much higher proportion of food. Secondly, they're the people who are paying for the housing, the education, and the NHS costs in the areas where the unskilled immigrants from the EU go. And thirdly, because their wages are depressed by more than double the national average, because that's kind of where they all are. And so we concluded from this that the cost to a poor person in Britain of the EU from these factors was 15%. Now, you know, what we know about the referendum is that poorer people voted in large numbers to leave, totally rationally. Because what has been happening, you see, and UKIP was the only party to point this out. What's been happening is that the EU has targeted poor people indirectly through high prices, through a system of free migration that's totally unfair to poor people, to their wages, to their living, you know, to their cost of living, and to the burden that they have to bear in terms of public taxes, effectively, or lack of public facilities. Now we were, you know, we kind of did the economics of this, and we explained this point. And I have to tell you that this became a very sore point in the debate, because many people said, oh, migration, it's got to be good. But they missed the point. Skilled migration, which is what we need, of course, because, you know, we need skilled workers, and they pay their way. They pay taxes, they make a contribution to the economy. But the other side of the debate missed the point that for ordinary people, unskilled immigration is the problem. And somehow this didn't really come across in the debate, because, you know, well, we tried very hard towards the end to explain this point, that it's an economic point, and it's a point of basic economic injustice. That an elite who benefit from cheap immigrant unskilled labour should force poor people to pay for it. So UKIP hit the nail on the head. And nobody else had the courage to say this. You were the only people who said it, apart from a few of us economists who made ourselves very unpopular, of course. But okay, so actually, this whole business of leaving the EU is about economics. Politics is about economics. Self-government is about being able to take decisions in your own economic interests, as well as, of course, of general freedom. I mean, there are lots of things that the EU tramples on in the way of our general freedoms, which are non-economic, it's true. I mean, we were talking about the arrest warrant, which is a gross piece of judicial, outrageous behavior, really. But so far, the EU has mainly confined itself to economic areas. The single market, the customs union. Now, all these are basically economic areas. But I think, rightly, UKIP focused on the fact that long-term the plans were to push powers into much broader areas. The arrest warrant is just the first indication, I think, of a much broader agenda of political union and general absorption of powers. And, you know, at the moment it's mainly an economic phenomenon, the European Union. But I think in the longer term, I think we all know that there is a political agenda there for political union, and essentially a sort of government of what you might call a sort of elitocracy. A sort of Euro elitocracy. I don't know how to describe it, so I can't think of a disgusting enough term.
Kleptocracy.
Really, to be honest, I can't think of a disgusting enough term, but I'm sure you can come up with one. But, you know, at the moment, which is where the debate has been, it's been mainly about economics. As I've said, the economics of trade, of productivity, regulation, and immigration, and specifically unskilled immigration, which is essentially subsidized by this system. And that's where all the problems have come from. So, you know, what have we got now today as we go into the question of getting Brexit done? I think the things we really need to explain to our politicians are that there are great gains from Brexit economically, because people's living standards will be higher for the reasons we've said. If you want to measure it in terms of GDP, it's 7% more on GDP if we get out of the customs union, get out of the single market, and we stop this immigration. 15% higher living standards for poorer people. 8% higher living standards for the average person. These are the economic gains. And then, you know, we have this extraordinary discussion today about the customs union. You know, the Ramona Brigade have now, after failing to get everybody to keep us in the single market, they tried that one, and it was pointed out that if we had the single market, the European Court of Justice would rule us forever and ever, amen. So they came off that one, and now they've come up with something called let's stay in the customs union. Now why do they say that?
Not the customs union.
Whatever. A customs union, the customs union. I think we know it all comes to the same damn thing. That the EU will again control our trade. Now somehow, because nobody in this country has understood trade for yonks, because it was always done by the EU, so no one in this country has been educated in what trade is. I come across politicians who don't even know what a tariff is. Or they get it the wrong way round, and they say a tariff, you know, well, that's what they levy on us, or we levy on them. So anyway, the fact is that customs union is the source of the main damage to our economy. It's the thing that puts prices up. It's the thing that causes massive inefficiency in our industry, because prices are too high and protecting inefficient producers. So when these wonderful Tory politicians, whose names I won't mention,
We will.
say, I'm sure you will, say, you know, we must stay in the customs union because it's such a wonderful thing, and somehow it'll be a soft Brexit. What they're doing is at a stroke denying the British people the main gain from leaving the EU. Essentially, the fall in prices, which comes from getting rid of the customs union, the rise in productivity, which comes from getting rid of the customs union, and the gain to GDP from having more efficient producers and a better living standard. So, you know, this is the latest red herring we're now discussing. The customs union. And you've got Tory politicians. I don't think they know what a customs union is. What they mean is that it's cuddly and European. They don't actually understand what it does. I am stunned by the illiteracy of many politicians, frankly. And the ones that I've found are economically literate have been in UKIP. Nigel Farage, the most sophisticated, well-educated about Europe politician I have ever met. And Gerard, of course, I have enormous respect for also. And I'm hoping I know he will carry on the good work. So, the truth is that this is an economic argument, and we need to explain to people why we're leaving. It isn't because we don't like Europeans, or we don't like immigrants, or anything else you want to manufacture, that we're racists, or we're thisists or thatists. It's because the economic interests and the political interests of the British people lie in having a better managed economy with free trade, with the Commonwealth, America, getting goods into this country at good prices, creating competition, raising people's living standards, getting better regulations so our world-beating city continues to beat the world and stays the #1. And let's remember, Europe needs a city much more than the city needs Europe. And so we have a government today which is fully committed, it says, to a clean, proper Brexit. But every day we pick up our newspapers, we hear about, you know, it's all very difficult, and you know, Mrs. Soubry loves the customs union, and you know, we all love Mrs. Soubry. Say, but the truth is, this government is, you know, is under pressure the whole time. And what we need, and I'll stop here, is UKIP to hold the feet of Mrs. May to the fire.
Yes. Here, here.
I've been instructed to take questions if you want to ask me any. So I don't know if you want to ask me.
Take your question.
Gloria has one.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Hang on. Ladies first. Sorry, Greg.
Oh, sorry.
Gloria. Okay,
Yeah, go
Professor Minford, I extol the fact that the City of London is the centre of the financial area, but they're desperate to remove that from us. Can they do so?
No.
Wow.
No, they can't. For you. They really can't.
They can't speak English.
I'll tell you for two reasons. One is that Europe really, the City of London is the main provider of efficient financial services to the whole of Europe. And therefore, if they were to say, we're not going to use the city, they would deny themselves an enormously efficient supplier of these services. And it would raise their costs very substantially. The second point is this, that the city, as I said, the city doesn't really need Europe because it sells its financial services all around the world. And if, you know, Europe decides it doesn't want to buy these services, they'll sell them to other grateful customers around the world at the same world prices, you know, because it is the world's leading financial center, and there's essentially these markets are global. And so if Europe decides it doesn't want to buy from the city will say, okay, I'll sell it to somebody else at the same price. And that's the way it works, basically.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
You, sir?
Greg, yeah.
Yeah, I'm the son of a migrant. Back in *53.
Sorry about that.
I'm the son of a migrant, came here in '53.
Oh, yes.
Windrush generation, only not quite. Different bloke coming from a different place. Economically, would you say that the people who are most disadvantaged by an uncontrolled immigration policy are immigrants?
Yeah.
Well, they're poor people.
Yeah.
Yeah, well said.
And of course,
Who's the poorest person? The person who turns up with nothing, or the person who turns
Well,
up with something?
the point is that yes, you're right. I mean, because a lot of poor people are immigrants from previous generations.
And my point is only this: if you lose legality of immigration policy, you fail to reward the people who come and get on, and you reward the people who come and don't. And
Well, exactly.
All I was trying to say is economic. I don't want to start on stupid ideas, but if you have a migration policy, surely it has to look after migrants.
Well, it does. I mean, the point really is that you see what happened when the EU brought in. Well, they've always had this fourth freedom under the single market. We joined the single market, and that entailed the so-called fourth freedom, which is that of migration. But of course, for many years, there were very few members of the EU, and none of them wanted to migrate here, except the odd skilled person. Of course, that all changed when there was an expansion of the EU to the east. And that was where everything went completely pear-shaped, because that fourth freedom was never designed, really, to allow uncontrolled, unskilled migration.
Well, 13,000, sir.
Exactly. A very large amounts of unskilled migration occurred as a result of that. And today there are, of course, over 3 million people from Europe here, of whom 1 million are unskilled. And the point is that the point really is this, that we subsidize unskilled migration because of the EU laws by 20%, because we give benefits that are unconditional. And that, of course, has made it a complete magnet and has meant that we've artificially stimulated the supply of unskilled migrants to the enormous costs of our own population.
And the migrants, is what I'm trying to say.
And indeed, and those migrants from previous generations, though not, of course, the new migrants. That's the point. Yeah, exactly.
To finish off the evening, we now have our final speaker, someone you all know, our very own MEP for London, the interim leader of UKIP, and now the full leader of UKIP, who's going to take us forward this year until Brexit Day. Please welcome Gerard Batten.
Well, I don't know quite how I'm going to follow these previous three terrific performances. I certainly haven't got the baritone voice of David there. It would make a terrific Don Giovanni, by the way. When you learn to sing.
Harry, everyone.
That's Bolton.
Professor Minford, now years ago, probably going back 20 years, I was listening to Professor Minford on platforms telling us why the EU was a bad idea. And thank goodness that he's still there doing that with the economists for Brexit. Terrific job you did there. And of course Stuart, who can always find new things to say about flatulence. Being a farmer and a very academically inclined kind of person. Now, today of course is St George's Day and Shakespeare's birthday. And if I may misquote Julius Caesar, some men are born to leadership, some men aspire to leadership, and some men have leadership thrust upon them. You all know which category I come into. And of course, we mustn't forget Richard II, who had a great quote applicable to all of the European treaties, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. England that was wont to conquer others has made a shameful conquest of itself. And this is what we've been doing ever since the traitor he signed the Treaty of Rome back in 1972. And it's been a very, very long fight to get where we are today. And I'm very, very pleased that we've got such intellectual giants as Professor Minford and Professor Condon actually arguing the case, the economic case for Britain to leave the European Union and supporting UKIP. And of course us lesser mortals who work merely by common sense are in agreement that you don't do something which is economically damaging to your country, and especially the people at the bottom of the economic ladder who can least protect themselves. It is common sense, and it is a very, very
sad and unfortunate thing that it's a commodity in such short supply in modern Britain. Now, as you all know, I stepped up to be the interim leader back at the end of January when I could see that it was all going very wrong and it wasn't going anywhere. I volunteered my services as the interim leader, and much to my surprise, the party took me up on that offer and made me the interim leader on the 17th of February. And I was in Scarborough at the weekend talking to the branch there, and somebody said to me, he said, it's a bit like that programme that they used to have on the TV. Do you remember where John Harvey Jones, the ex-ICI, when he retired and didn't have anything to do, they made a TV programme where he went around and looked at failed businesses. Yeah. Well, he said, you're a bit like that. That's how I felt actually when I took this over, because it is actually a bit like a business. And I went into the business and I found that they still had an office, they still had some staff, and everything else had been cut off. You know, the gas had been cut off, the electricity was cut off. There wasn't anything else. I wasn't surprised, but I was shocked at what had been left by the previous collective leadership, which was basically nothing. Now, I will say that we had 8 or 9 terrific people there down in Newton Abbot who were still running the show on fairly low wages, I have to say. They're not the most highly paid people in the world. But if it hadn't been for those people, UKIP would have folded, because they're the ones that actually keep the machine ticking over.
Three cheers.
The first thing I did when I took over was to go down to Newton Abbot and have a look at the figures. And of course I found that we were on the edge of insolvency, which I kind of knew anyway, but we were, in the first couple of weeks of March, we would have become insolvent, the party would have had to be closed down, and it would have ended 25 years, almost 26 years, of what I think is a glorious history, which Patrick has alluded to there, would have come to an end. So what did I do? Well, it took me about a week to find a chairman to run the party. I found Tony McIntyre, who stepped up into the role. I don't think he quite knew what he was taking on, and I certainly didn't tell him too much. But he stepped up into the role. He's a volunteer. He's doing this in his own time. He's retired, thank goodness, because he needs a lot of time. And then eventually I found a new treasurer in the shape of Seb Fairweather, who has done an absolutely amazing job. So the first thing I had to do was to find the money. And I looked at the figures, and I thought, well, looking at the creditors that we've got, how much money we owe, we need £100,000. And I thought, there's only one way. I'm not going to go to the donors because they wouldn't give it. Why would they? Why would you chuck your money into a black hole if you were a major donor to this party? So I thought, what do I do? How do I solve the problem? I'll go to the members and ask the members, the people that I've been going around and talking to for the last 25 years and who've listened to me, put up with me, and grown the party. And I thought, will I be able to get 100,000 quid? I'm not sure I'll be able to do it. What did they do? They gave us £300,000. And why did they do that?
Because we believe in it.
It isn't,
yes.
Exactly. It isn't because I'm the best political leader since Napoleon, because I'm not. I'm a slightly taller than Napoleon. It was because they knew they could trust me, and they believe in this party and our cause. What they've done with that money is put us back firmly into the black. They've enabled us to pay our operational costs out. Membership dues coming in every month, so we are now functioning again. A few weeks ago I got a very nasty surprise when on my desk turned up a legal bill for £175,000 from a previous misadventure that we got involved in, which I won't say too much about. But we found a way of paying that bill as well, separate from the £300,000. People rallied to us and we managed to pay that bill. And I can't tell you how upset that must have made the Labour Party. There was the Labour Party, there was Channel 4, there was the Times and the Sunday Times, all just waiting for us to disappear from view and go down the political plug hole, but we're not. We're on the field. We are still on the battlefield. We are
grooming gangs.
Sorry, pardon?
And so are the grooming gangs, Gerard.
Well, give me time. Can't tackle everything at once. But we're still on the battlefield. Our army is still there. But what does an army need when it's had a difficult time on the battlefield? It needs a banner raised that it can rally to. And your army rallies around the banner and it attacks again, it counterattacks. And this is what we're doing now with the local elections. When I took over, there was absolutely no preparations been made for the local elections whatsoever. Again, I was not surprised with a ball. And we have now had 554 candidates in place. Our opponents, you know, the other political parties, the media, oh, UKIP's number of candidates has collapsed by 75%. Well, let me tell you, if the party hadn't rallied behind me, there would have been 0 candidates because there would have been 0 party. The fact that we've got 554 candidates means that we've got 250 more than the Spartans had at Thermopylae. And we all know that their names are immortal. Everybody remembers them. Nobody remembers the Persians that fell. And nobody will remember the traitors that tried to betray our country into the European Union in years and centuries to come. So the big question, we put the party back in the black. Now today is also St George's Day, and we all know what he was famous for, which was slaying a dragon. And there are lots of dragons still left to be slain. So I know that the question I'm going to get asked, and actually after I did quite a good performance the day after I was made the interim leader and managed to defend myself, I found that I had fewer invitations to go back onto the media. But I have got one next Sunday, which is on the Preston programme, and I'm sure that the big question they're going to ask me is, what is UKIP for now? Why do we need UKIP? And of course I will talk about individual policies, which I'll say something about. But I tell you why we're needed in this country, because we need a political party that believes in this country, that represents the kind of people that Professor Minford is talking about, the ordinary, hard-working people at the bottom who actually work, actually pay the taxes and make the country function. And these are the kind of people that I want to represent. These are the people that I come from. These are the people who get the dirty end of the stick. And these are the people who've had enough. They're fed up with the way things are. They want something different. And what do they want that's different? Well, Brexit. They want to leave the European Union, despite the whole catalogue of lies that they were told during that campaign. Despite the campaign of fear that they were subjected to, they still voted to leave. And I don't want another referendum, but if we had another referendum, I can tell you that we would get a bigger majority than we've got on the 23rd of June. And what we can see is our political establishment, led by Theresa the Appeaser, is doing everything they can to delay, impede Brexit so that they can eventually overturn it and not do it at all. Well, we've got to fight to make sure that that happens, and I believe that we've got 2 outcomes here. Either they will arrive at a withdrawal agreement, which is really not leaving at all, it's leaving in name or not in reality, or they try to overturn it. If we get the withdrawal agreement that isn't really leaving, you will need UKIP in the years ahead to argue for a complete exit, a complete and total clean exit. So that's why you need us. You need us to argue about immigration. Not because we're against immigration, not because we don't want migrants, but because we want the right type of migrants in the right context, in the right numbers. I came here tonight and I went for a coffee in a coffee bar. I had a beggar came up to me who was asking me for money in Spanish. He couldn't speak English. At least it sounded like Spanish. And I thought, well, what kind of immigration policy is it that allows people in to beg who can't even speak your language?
I've got 2 at my bus stop.
It's insanity. And as for the people who come from all over the world, I don't think we've got an immigration policy at all, in actual fact. Anybody seems to be able to turn up if they feel like it. It would be much better to actually have programs, economic and financial programs, to help those people in their own countries, rather than to encourage us to come here. So that's one thing. Immigration and Brexit needs to be attacked. But also an economic system that works for ordinary people. I have had a privileged life. I grew up in the East End of London after the Second World War. We played on bomb sites, very much against health and safety rules now. We wouldn't be allowed to do it now. I got a very low paid job. I got a better job. I worked my way up over 30 odd years to have a well paid job. I managed to buy a house. I managed to look after a family. And I'm very, very pleased. I never had to fight in a war. I've lived in a free country. I've had the benefits of free speech fairly recently. And I've managed to do all that. And I look at future generations, the next generation coming up, and I'm fearful they don't have that. The kind of job that I had, a steady, well-paid, reliable job, they're all going now. People are on 0 hours contracts. They can't actually have the kind of career I had. They don't exist anymore. People are now in a much more dog-eat-dog economic system. Their children can't find places to live or rent at reasonable prices to buy or rent. And we are now seeing, for the first time in a very long time, the economic standards declining, and our children and grandchildren are going to have lower standards of living than we do. And in the meantime, they are being denied free speech in their own country. Yes. And these are the things that we have to fight for. This is the kind of party that I want UKIP to be. A patriotic party that loves its own country, that isn't ashamed or frightened to say it loves it, doesn't dislike or hate anybody else, doesn't want to do a disservice to our neighbours. We want to have trade, friendship and cooperation, not just with Europe, but with the rest of the world. That we've been saying since the earliest days of UKIP, 25, 26 years ago, right from the start, and we've never varied it, and we mean it. We want all those things, but we want to live in a country that we are proud of, and we're not frightened to defend, and we're proud of its history. And we can do that, whatever your ethnic or racial background is. You can join UKIP, you can call yourself British, you can call yourself English, you can be proud of your country, and you can respect and admire other people's countries. But we want to make our own laws in our own country from our own democratically elected politicians in our own parliament. I'll just wind up and finish. What we want, and this is what makes me so angry, when you hear the commentators on the TV saying that anyone that believes in these things is far right. What have we campaigned for 25, 26 years? To be governed under our own laws, our own statute law, our own common law, by our own elected politicians in our own parliament, in accordance with our own constitution. That's what we want. To me, that is the most natural thing in the world. And the reason that we still need UKIP is because we are the only opposition to the political establishment. The Uni-Party, as somebody said earlier on, where it doesn't matter if you vote for Mrs May and the Tories, it doesn't really matter if you vote for Corbyn, because you're going to end up in the same place anyway by different means. Now, I know that the struggle that we face is extremely difficult in the political system that we've got, but I also know that UKIP is full of heroic people who are going to go out there, organise the branch meetings, go to the boring routine branch meetings, organise the local elections, organise the by-elections and the parliamentary elections, and you're going to continue coming back fighting until we win. Thank you.
Yes.